In a December of muted lights and frozen canals, a British rock icon believed he had finally outrun the taxman by vanishing into the quiet of Denmark. He was one of roughly 300 international artists who flooded the country, chasing the same seductive promise of a capped tax rate. But why did this so-called Scandinavian tax hell turn into a financial trap for so many of them? By the end of this story, you will understand why Eddie Van Halen once felt compelled to renounce his own American citizenship just to escape the consequences. The story of how the most generous tax deal in the history of rock and roll came to exist begins not in a recording studio, but in a quiet corner of the Danish tax code. It was in 1966 that the Danish government, through its International Tax Authority, introduced a special residence rule for wealthy foreigners. This informal arrangement, which everyone would come to call the Danish Act, offered a flat tax rate of just 30% on all income earned within the country's borders. At the time, this was an almost unthinkable bargain for any high earner looking to escape the punishing fiscal systems of their homelands. To understand just how revolutionary this offer was, you have to look at the numbers facing a regular Danish citizen. By 1990, the Danish Tax Authority confirmed that the standard income tax rate for a citizen could climb as high as 52%, a figure that placed Denmark near the very top of the global tax league table. In fact, a 2021 study from the World Bank and the OECD found that the marginal tax rate for Denmark's highest earners trailed only Belgium on the world stage. This made the existential act of working and earning a living in Denmark a financial challenge for everyone, except, of course, for a foreigner arriving with a guitar case and a contract. The true nature of the Danish Act was not a separate law written in bold letters, but rather a subtle provision buried deep within the country's main tax collection statute, a section known as Ligningsloven 33F. For the artists who would later benefit from it, this legal technicality mattered little. The offer was simple, a lifetime access card to one of the world's most expensive countries for the price of a flat 30% on everything you made. The allure was irresistible, especially when you layered in the fact that almost everything you had to buy in Denmark to live and work was subject to a crushing 25% value-added tax, as documented by the OECD's tax database in 2020. The generous rate on the front end seemed to make up for the expensive reality on the ground. But this apparent paradise raised an immediate and uncomfortable question. Why would a country famous for its high taxes and egalitarian values single out the wealthy for such a sweetheart deal? The answer lay in the government's hope that a low tax bill would lure international talent, their spending money, and their glamour into the Danish economy. Yet, this well-intentioned policy was creating a dangerous temptation, opening the door to a period of outrageous schemes and shocking decisions that would make Scandinavian tax law a terrifying legend in the world of rock and roll. And the first musician brave enough to test these waters was an Englishman with a harmonica and a dream of escaping the taxman, someone ready to gamble his career on a foreign promise. By the early 1970s, the promise of a flat 30% tax rate proved almost irresistible to a generation of British rockers who had watched the British Inland Revenue claim as much as 83% of their earnings. John Mayall, the godfather of British blues, was among the very first to test the waters. He packed his bags and moved to Denmark, convinced that the Danish Act would be his financial salvation, a quiet haven where his music could flourish without the taxman breathing down his neck. Yet the reality that greeted him was a far cry from any fiscal paradise. Mayall later confessed to Mojo magazine in 2015 that he discovered a brutal irony. While the tax rate at the border was indeed low, the cost of living in Denmark was staggeringly high, and the revenue from shows played in the rural Danish countryside was nowhere near enough to cover his expenses. The rugged, rain-swept fields outside Copenhagen were a world away from the lucrative London circuits, and every gig felt like a step backward rather than a step up. He lasted less than 2 years before retreating, a pioneer who had opened the door only to find a cold draft waiting on the other side. Was he alone in this miscalculation? Hardly. In fact, his story became a cautionary tale whispered among the ranks of touring musicians. Between 1970 and 1990, roughly 300 international artists and athletes flocked to Denmark, lured by the same dream of lighter taxes, according to a 2015 report from the Danish newspaper Politiken. They came in waves, these hopefuls with guitars and contracts, all convinced they had cracked the code. Yet the numbers tell a more complicated story about who actually stayed and prospered. versus who quietly slipped away once the novelty wore off. The peak year, 1985, saw about 550 foreigners filing their taxes under this special arrangement. But by 2005, that number had plunged to just 137. So what happened to the other hundreds who once believed they had found their sanctuary? Some left, citing the very same frustrations Mayall endured, while others discovered that the real financial drain was not the headline tax rate, but the hidden, everyday costs that gnawed away at their earnings until the supposed great deal turned into a great mistake. The dream was real, but so was the hangover. It was the autumn of 1971 when the most famous rock band in the world came to Copenhagen, and their arrival should have been the crowning glory of Denmark's tax experiment. Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones were there to put the finishing touches on Exile on Main Sonar, a double album that would become a landmark of the decade. Yet the city's vaunted 30% rate could not hold them. The band's management balked at paying the tax on their recording expenses, insisting the costs of studio time and lodging should be deductible under any reasonable system. Danish law, however, refused to allow such deductions, treating every krone spent on the album as pure taxable income. When a particularly astronomical bill for transatlantic phone calls arrived, the impasse became absurd, and the Stones simply packed up and left for Switzerland. In his 2010 memoir, Life, Keith Richards recalled how the Swiss offered a flat 25% rate with none of the Nordic bureaucracy, a model Denmark would later quietly copy. Even the most accommodating tax haven, it turned out, could not compete with a system that made chartered jets and hotel suites feel like luxuries the government had a right to tax. The band had come seeking refuge from Britain's 95% top rate, only to discover that a lower number on paper meant nothing when every practical necessity carried a hidden surcharge. A letter displayed at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland tells the same story from the other side of the stage. Ian Gillan of Deep Purple wrote to friends in 1972 that his Danish tax bill for a brief tour had grown so enormous he had to sell his house in Surrey to cover it. How could a law designed to lure artists produce such crushing bills for a single performance? The answer lay in the fine print that no publicity brochure ever mentioned, and the Rolling Stones became the first major act to walk away from the deal. Their exit sent a quiet signal through the industry, though the flood of musicians kept coming, seduced by headlines that promised paradise. What the Stones understood, and what so many others would learn too late, was that the real taxation began only after the applause faded. So who were the ones who stayed, and what did they sacrifice in exchange for that seemingly golden rate? The Danish system demands that visiting performers declare every penny earned on its soil, yet it simultaneously refuses to recognise the very costs that made that income possible. It is a quiet, brutal arithmetic. Hotel bills, meals and transport are not deductible, so a musician can book a Copenhagen show and watch the profit evaporate before the encore. The International Tax Journal noted in 2017 that this creates a silent tax, an invisible levy that inflates the real burden far beyond the advertised rate. How does a working artist even begin to navigate such a one-sided arrangement? The process, as outlined by the Danish tax authority SCAT in 2019, is a labyrinth of bureaucratic rigidity that punishes the unprepared. First, you must establish your tax residency status back home, because Denmark will not do that work for you. Second, you're instructed to record every single piece of income generated on Danish territory, and that includes the complimentary lunch a venue might offer. Third, you must list all your travel and accommodation expenses, not because they reduce your bill, but simply so you can watch them be ignored. Fourth, you have to file your return through the SCAT portal within 30 days of the performance, a deadline that feels deliberately cruel when you are already halfway across Europe. Finally, you are expected to prepare original documents in both English and Danish, a bilingual paper trail that would tax the patience of any tour manager. But the nightmare does not stop at the border, because royalty income is treated as a completely separate beast from performance fees. According to SCAT records from 1998, royalties can be taxed at a staggering rate of up to 60% if they are not meticulously specified within the legal contract. That means a songwriter who earns from streaming a live session in Copenhagen could sacrifice more than half of that revenue through a loophole they never knew existed. And for those who think a simple European tour will shield them, a 2018 study by Ernst & Young reveals the true scale of the ambush. International artists can surrender anywhere from 40 to 60% of their total tour income to taxes across the Nordics without a double taxation treaty. So, a band might believe they are banking a healthy profit from 3 sold-out nights, only to discover they owe more than they actually brought home. The low rate was always a seductive lie, a glossy price tag that hid the true cost hidden in the fine print. You have probably heard the comforting myth whispered in dressing rooms and tour buses across the world. Stay in Scandinavia for less than 30 days, and the taxman will never find you. But the reality of performing on Danish soil is far less forgiving, and the rules are written in stone. According to Anderson Tax Advisory in 2019, any single performance delivered within Danish territory must be reported and taxed within 3 months, regardless of how brief your visit might be. The 30-day rule is a dangerous illusion that has bankrupted more than one careless act. Rock musicians often confuse Denmark's flat artist tax with Germany's stage tax, but the two could not be more different. In Germany, the Bundesmusikverband confirmed back in 1994 that a special consumption tax is applied directly to ticket sales at the venue, completely separate from any personal income declaration. This misunderstanding leads many touring bands to assume they have already paid their dues when they have actually paid nothing at all to Danish authorities. The distinction is subtle, yet the financial consequences are devastating for those who get it wrong. Consider what happened in 1983. When the American rock band Kiss threatened to cancel their single Copenhagen concert unless authorities released 50% of their record sales revenue. They were only performing one night, yet they understood that Danish law made no exceptions for brief appearances. Rolling Stone Japan documented this standoff, and it reveals how even the biggest names in rock were forced to negotiate from a position of fear. The lesson is simple. Duration of stay has never been the deciding factor in Danish tax law. Even the supporting musicians who never see their names on the main contract are not protected from this system. Live Nation Denmark's legal findings from 2003 showed that a touring guitarist must pay the full 30% personal tax even when entirely unmentioned in the performance agreement. The tax code does not care about your role in the band, your fame, or your billing. It only cares about where the work happened. So the next time someone tells you that Nordic tours are tax-free for short stays, remember that the real punchline comes later, when the invoice from SCAT finally arrives. In 1985, Eddie Van Halen, the American-born son of a Dutch mother and an Indonesian father, made a decision that would stun the rock world. He relocated to Denmark, the land of his ancestors, and publicly declared he was renouncing his United States citizenship. The guitar god, whose name was synonymous with American excess and the California Sunset Strip, was willing to trade it all for a tax rate that promised to keep more of his fortune in his own pocket. But the Danish paradise he sought was not the spacious mansion or the serene coastline. It was a single, simple number on a tax form. The allure of the 30% flat rate was so potent that it made a man abandon the very country that had made him a superstar. Yet, the twist in this tale is not his desperate gamble, but the quiet, almost bureaucratic reason he ultimately retreated back to America. It wasn't a change of heart or a sudden patriotic surge. It was the grinding, unglamorous machinery of immigration law, a problem no tax break could solve. This extreme act of financial rebellion was more than just a personal anecdote. It was a bellwether for a broader cultural shift. The spectacle of one of rock's greatest heroes choosing a Danish tax ID over his American passport was a story too good for the press to ignore. It fueled a growing, public resentment back home in Denmark, where the perception of a privileged class was becoming a political liability. Flemming Rose, a prominent Danish journalist, publicly condemned the entire arrangement, calling it an insult to the ordinary Danish taxpayer, who was funding the social safety net that these wealthy foreigners were so eager to exploit. His was a voice of a growing contingent who felt the law was a slap in the face to every citizen who paid their share without complaint. The narrative had shifted from a clever incentive to a symbol of inequality, and the momentum for change was building. By 1992, the phenomenon had become so widespread that it needed a name, a label that captured its full scope. British music journalist Charles Shaw popularised the term Nordic tax axis to describe the mass migration of record labels and their artists. They were moving their physical printing operations to Sweden and Denmark not for the inspiration, but for the loopholes, a blatant attempt to shield revenue from the UK's escalating tax demands. It was a corporate retreat, a desperate scramble for financial cover. The official numbers, however, painted a far more cynical picture than any story of a struggling musician seeking a break. While the number of international artists performing in Denmark exploded, growing by an astonishing 300% between 1980 and 1990, the number actually paying tax under the special scheme increased by a paltry 10%. Where was all the money going? Denmark's radio, the national broadcaster, put it plainly. Most acts touring through the country were not paying their 30% at all. Instead, they were being paid dividends from shell companies based in third countries, a corporate structure designed entirely to funnel money around the Danish taxman. The law wasn't just a sanctuary for the famous. It was a tool for the wealthy to build elaborate fortresses of legal avoidance. And it was a game that not everyone could play, with Eddie Van Halen's citizenship serving as the ultimate and ultimately futile high-stakes bet. If Denmark was a complicated bargain, Sweden was where the whole dream went to die. At home, the top marginal income tax rate reached a staggering 90% during the 1970s, a figure that made even the most loyal citizens question their choices. Björn Ulvaeus of ABBA described the situation as being completely impossible to work in, a sentiment that echoed through the corridors of every recording studio in Stockholm. The state, in its zeal to redistribute wealth, had created an environment where creative ambition was punished rather than rewarded. How could any artist, no matter how patriotic, justify giving 9/10 of their labour to a system that offered so little in return? The answer for many was that they could not, and they voted with their feet. ABBA, the nation's most beloved export, made the painful decision to leave their homeland in the late 70s, trading the familiar gloom of Stockholm for the more forgiving tax climates of England and then America. This was not a move of arrogance, but one of sheer survival. The wealth tax had escalated to roughly 80% on their highest earnings, a crushing burden that threatened to undo everything they had built. In a move that still stuns music historians, the group was forced to sell their own record company, Polar Music, simply to scrape together the funds needed to settle their monumental tax bill. Across the Atlantic and across the sports world, tennis legend Bjorn Borg faced the same unbearable arithmetic. In 1980, at the absolute peak of his powers, he fled to Monte Carlo, a glamorous haven in France, to escape a tax system that demanded around 80% of his fortune. The image of these global icons, flushed out of their homeland by fiscal policy, is a stark testament to the era's punishing economics. Sweden finally recognised the damage it was inflicting and abolished its special artist law in 1983, forcing foreign performers to pay the standard income tax, which still stood at a punishing 56%. But the damage was done. The golden goose had been chased away. If even the very symbols of Swedish success couldn't afford to stay, what hope was there for anyone else? It began with a London management firm that thought it had found the perfect loophole. In 2014, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs accused this company of registering a shell operation in the Danish city of Aarhus, a phantom entity designed to sign performance contracts for rock acts under that tempting 30% rate. The alternative, after all, was Britain's punishing 45% top band, a difference substantial enough to make deception seem rational. But here was the wrinkle the architects of the scheme had failed to anticipate. Danish tax authorities simply refused to issue any penalty, claiming they possessed no data on the artist's earnings, because the real business, the money, the decision-making, all of it remained firmly planted on British soil. The Guardian covered the story with the quiet bewilderment of a trade that had finally witnessed the machine jam itself. What kind of enforcement system turns down the chance to crack down on tax evasion when it is handed to them on a platter? The answer, as investigators would learn, was a system so tangled in jurisdictional knots that responsibility itself had become a ghost. For a decade prior, from 1990 to 2000, SCAT, the Danish Tax Authority, had conducted well over 100 deep audits on foreign artist management companies operating in both Aarhus and Copenhagen, digging through contracts and tour schedules with forensic determination. Yet here they were, in 2014, watching a clear case of sham contracting dissolve into bureaucratic paralysis, the letter of the law bowing to the absence of shared paperwork. The absurdity deepened when you remembered the precedent already set in 1991, when Sony Music dragged a British artist into a Danish courtroom because he had declared his income low enough to claim housing benefits, while his UK filings showed earnings more than 3 times that figure. That case had been a warning, a sign that the system could bite when it wanted to. So why, a generation later, did the same system stand down when confronted with a far more elaborate ruse? Perhaps the real discovery here was that a tax haven's greatest protection was not the law itself, but the silent agreement between two governments that neither would look too closely at the other's paperwork. The London firm, no doubt, celebrated its unearned victory, but the story left a bitter taste for everyone watching. How many other shell companies were quietly operating in those medieval streets, immune not because they were clever, but because the institutions meant to police them were too tangled in their own borders to act? The 2014 case never produced a landmark verdict, never clarified the rules, never even secured a fine. It simply vanished into the administrative fog, leaving a single troubling conclusion. Sometimes the safest way to escape the taxman is to make sure he cannot quite prove you exist. And that, for the rock star, who had risked everything for a clever accounting trick, was a lesson both liberating and deeply unsettling. The system, they now understood, was not a fortress of logic. It was a maze of handoffs, and the only true crime was getting caught in the wrong corridor at the wrong moment. The real victims of Denmark's tax paradise were never the headliners. They were the drummers and the stage technicians, the working backbone of every tour, who found themselves trapped in a system designed for the rich and famous. These were the people taxed on a modest income framework, yet their accumulated days on the road pushed them into a category Danish authorities called permanent activity, a status that stripped them of the very exemptions their employers had promised. A union report from the Tour Infrastructure Union in 1985 documented how these crew members, earning a fraction of a rock star's fee, were the ones most likely to face the full, unforgiving weight of the law without the legal teams to fight it. But here is the quiet tragedy. The law did not care about the difference between a stadium-filling guitarist and the man who tuned his instruments. It saw only taxable income appearing on Danish soil. So a session player who flew in for a single festival could owe more in paperwork and penalties than he earned for the entire weekend's work. The system, in its cold efficiency, had created a silent tax, a levy that fell hardest on those who could least afford a lawyer to explain it away. How is it fair that a technician, whose name appears in no contract and whose face is unknown to the crowd, should carry a burden that the star never even feels? This was the invisible cost of the Scandinavian dream, paid in full by the people who made the magic possible, but never got to share in the applause. Nearly 70% of international artists surveyed by Billboard magazine in 2017 admitted they had no idea or only a vague notion of the Nordic tax maze before they signed their touring deals. They were walking into a legal minefield with no map, and the consequences were as severe as they were unexpected. The penalties for late filing, the interest on unpaid amounts, and the sheer confusion of a system that refused to deduct basic travel and meal costs, it all compounded into a financial disaster that could wipe out an entire tour's profit. But there was a group for whom this was not an abstract risk, but a lived nightmare, and their stories never made the headlines. Consider Frank, a 55-year-old American touring drummer, a man whose career had taken him to every corner of the globe, but whose name you would never recognize. When his company signed him up for a European tour, the lawyers inserted a clause that seemed bizarre at the time. A hard limit of 3 performances in Denmark, no exceptions. They told him that playing a 4th show would mean losing money, that the tax liability would exceed his fee for the entire week. Frank, who had been on the road since the 1980s, found this both absurd and humiliating. And then came the kicker, the moment of bitter irony. Despite playing just 2 dates in the country, he was still assessed a tax bill, not for those 2 shows, but for the entirety of his European tour earnings, double taxed on income he had already paid on at home. The lawyers had been right, the system was a trap, so the next time you see a band's drum kit being assembled, remember that the man carrying the cymbals might be carrying a debt he never signed up for, all because he was foolish enough to try and make a living doing what he loved. But hey, was he supposed to just say no to a tour of a lifetime? So the Danish Act survived decades of criticism, and the reason is that from the government's perspective, the numbers actually worked. A 2005 study from the University of Copenhagen found that even with the tax break, the money those visiting artists generated for the economy was too significant to ignore.